Hope you are enjoying the conference. Let's start, right, Siddha? Welcome to the second day of the conference and also to the second plenary talk. I'm extremely honored to introduce Professor Morten Ravn to all of you. He does not need any introduction, but anyway, let me tell you a bit about him. We all know he is one of the finest minds in the field of macroeconomics. Presently, he's a professor at University College London. He's a CPR Research Fellow, co-director of the ESRC Center for Macroeconomics, Deputy Chairman of the Danish National Research Foundation. He's one of the coordinating joint managing editors of the Economic Journal. He's also a fellow of the European Economic Association. He has taught at various places, including European University Institute, London Business School, University Pompeu Fabra, University of Aarhus, and University of Southampton. He has worked on an extremely wide range of topics, including fiscal and monetary policies. His current research is mainly focused on the aggregate demand and idiosyncratic risk, expectations on the crisis, deep habits, participation choices, and macro labor fluctuations. All his papers have deep contribution to the field of economics. Let me talk about a couple of them. He has a seminal paper published in 2002, which basically investigates how the smoothing parameter of the HP filter should be adjusted when changing the frequency of observations. It has been published in 2002, and it has around 2,000 citations in Google Scholar. And yes, the deep habits, his contribution along with Ms. Grohe and Uribe, they actually generalize the concept of habit formation by considering the possibility that private agents do not simply form habits from their overall consumption level, but rather from the consumption of individual goods. The assumption that agents can form habits on good-by-good basis has important implications for aggregate dynamics. He also has seminal contribution to the literature of PPP puzzle, his research on estimating the dynamic effects of changes in taxes in the US, and his study on fiscal policy in an expectation-driven liquidity trap made significant impact to the field of macroeconomics. Today, he will speak about sentimental business cycles. So without further delay, I would like to invite Professor Morten Ravn to come to the floor.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. This works? Okay. I'm always slightly embarrassed about that paper on the Hodrick Prescott filter, because it took literally 5 minutes to do that on the blackboard. But then somebody programmed it up and it gets lots of citations. So I'm very happy to be here and to talk at ISI. ISI, a very famous institution. We had lots of at least some good students from ISI in the past, and I see lots of good students here. So I enjoy a lot working with students, so I'm getting a lot of utility out of that. So the paper I'm presenting today is a slightly crazy paper, and you will see why. But the problem we are trying to address, I think, is an important one. And essentially, what we're thinking about in this paper here is the sources of fluctuations in the economy over time. And in much of macroeconomic theory, actually, the models that we work with, they have sort of two sources of fluctuations in there. So one source of fluctuations are kind of called fundamental shocks. So we all know what they are. But in lots of macro models, actually, there's also the possibility of purely belief-driven fluctuations. And so that can happen in many, many different settings in economic theory. And in many of the macro models that we work with, those belief-driven fluctuations are always there in the background. But it's usually not something we really pay that much attention to, at least when we're trying to match up with data. However, if you look at policy, it's quite clear it is something that is on the minds of policymakers all over the world. So, so for example, if you go and read OECD or IMF or World Bank or Federal Reserve Bank reports on the economy, they always talk about the state of how consumers, the confidence consumers and producers have in the economy. Now, so there may be different reasons for why policymakers pay a lot of attention to the confidence of producers and consumers, but one possible reason is that those kind of data have information in them itself that policymakers may want to react to. But if you look out there, then I think the good summary of the state of the nature is that there's a lot of very high quality recent work on the sources of fluctuations economy that use causal methods to estimate the impact of various kinds of what we call fundamental shocks. So what are fundamental shocks? It's like technology shocks, maybe changes in productivity of capital goods. Is policy shocks, monetary, fiscal policy shocks. Trade policy is, of course, like coming from Britain right now, something I worry about. Or credit shocks. Oil price shocks would be important, commodity price shocks in general. And then there's a recent list that looks at uncertainty shocks, so Nick Bloom's papers on TFP uncertainty, and more recently lots of works on policy uncertainty. So the recent literature has made a lot of progress in trying to estimate the causal impact of these kind of shocks there. But the sort of interesting thing is that when you do that and you try and pick up all these different kinds of shocks, then there's always a big chunk that's unaccounted for. So the question is, what is that other stuff that's unaccounted for? So for example, I don't know if you listened recently to any talks by Bob Hall, but Bob Hall has this thing about if you look at the labor market and you look at unemployment in the aggregate and across sectors and look at vacancy postings of firms, those they have a sort of a common component. It seems unrelated to anything else you kind of put the finger on. It's not the stock market. It's not something else. And also, if you look at the work of Schiller, for example, he thinks that there is some stuff going on in stock markets that's sort of driving the economy that's unrelated to the economy. So that is one potential source of the other stuff that's going on. So what is that more precisely? Well, part of it could be new shocks. So what I mean by new shocks, so there's some information that gets revealed about future values of these fundamental shocks, but they're sort of not reflected in these fundamental variables today. But it could also be purely belief driven kind of stuff. So things like animal spirits or expectational shocks or other kinds of non-fundamental shocks. So while I think there's a lot of good work on causal identification of the first block, there's less so on the second block. There is lots of work on new shock. Whether that's really causal is another question. But the challenge you face here is that how do you estimate causal effects of non-fundamental shocks? It kind of seems like you need a little bit of magic because it's sort of things that you can't see. Okay? So of course, any kind of, if you think about structural shocks by assumption are sort of unobserved. So whenever we want to estimate causal effects, we need sort of try and come up with something that's observable. And that, like you think about technology shocks or monetary policy shocks, it's kind of clear how we do that. But with these other shocks, it is instead very difficult. So with new shocks, there is work on this, and usually the way that is addressed is by, for example, using information from asset prices. So if you think about new shocks in terms of shocks to shocks about future technology, So while that may not be revealed in the level of technology today, it may be revealed by asset prices today if private agents have some information about this. But that, of course, does rely on a certain informational structure. There's also work that uses very structural models to come up with this. Multiple equilibria, that could be another source here. There is not very much work on that in macro. There is some attempts at looking at multiple equilibria, again using structural models. When it comes to pure belief-driven stuff, so animal spirits kind of stuff, then there's very little in terms of causal evidence. There's some stuff that look at disaggregate data, so work by Mian and Sufi and Gusku, Benabib and Spiegel, and Lagerborg, where they look at some reflections of these non-fundamental shocks, but not really at the aggregate level. So what I'll try and do in this paper here is to come up with causal evidence about these kind of belief-driven fluctuations here. So that's what I'll call sentimental business cycles, when they have fluctuations that are driven by sentiment. So you can think about it like, think about what happened in Argentina before the currency crisis. The economy was taking off. Everybody was assuming, of course, TFP was very high. One day they realized, oh my God, TFP is actually not high, and you had a huge crash. Or you can think about it also in terms of maybe think about what's going on in an economy like India right now, where you see things like land prices going up. Is that fundamentals, or is that because of belief in land prices going up? So sort of bubble kind of stuff. Okay. So that's where I want to try and put the finger on. Now, in this paper, I'm going to think about business cycles, so fluctuations in the economy over time. I'm going to look at the US, but I think this can be done more generally. But the fundamental problem here is how to come up with causal evidence. And I would say at this point there's really nothing. So I think we're one of the first to try to come up with direct causal evidence. And what I'm going to work on the data first, and then I'm going to turn to a model afterwards. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to estimate the dynamic causal effects of sentiment shock. So I'm going to ask the question, suppose we wake up one day and consumers or firms, they kind of have over-optimistic or over-pessimistic views. What happens after that? Okay, do we see any reflections of that in the real economy? And the way I'm going to try and do that is I'm going to propose using an instrumental variables approach for estimation, but in a macro setup where I'm going to use a vector regression. Okay, then having come up with some causal evidence here, I'm going to try and interpret that in a model, and the model I'm going to use for this is a relatively sophisticated model, so it has a lot of stuff going on. It's a model in which there's incomplete information and Bayesian learning in a setup with heterogeneous agents and frictions in goods and labor markets. So in goods markets, there are going to be pricing frictions. In labor markets, going to be matching frictions. The reason why I use a relatively complicated model here is because this particular model I have is one in which there is sort of an interesting amplification mechanism that works through interaction of the demand and supply side, which you don't get this in models with either flexible prices or without heterogeneous agents. So this model has a new amplification mechanism. And then I'm going to take my model and I'm going to try and estimate by matching up with the causal evidence. I'm going to try and estimate key structural parameters. I'm going to be particularly interested in a couple of parameters here. And I'm going to use that model to kind of interpret what you see in the data. Okay. I should warn that usually when I give this presentation, I don't have much time for 2 and 3 here, so I may be running a little bit when I get to that. Okay. You have to give me a 10-minute warning. Okay. So the first step is to come up with the causal evidence. So I wanna try and provide causal evidence for how changes in sentiments they impact on the economy. And I want to have what the challenge here is to isolate autonomous changes in sentiment. So something that's not related to the fundamentals. Okay, so at the core of this, I'm going to use data from the University of Michigan Survey of Consumer Confidence. And the reason why I'm going to use this is because that's a long-running survey. And so if you want to do time series, you always need a relatively long time series. So I'm going to use this one. So the Michigan Survey of Consumer Confidence has been conducted since the late 40s. It's monthly since 77, quarterly since 52. Every month they ask 500 randomly drawn persons about their views about their own economic situation and about their views about the US economy. And they produce 3 indices, one that's called the Index of Consumer Sentiment, and that's a mix of 2 underlying indices, the Index of Current Economic Conditions and the Index of Consumer Expectations. So an index, the ICC, is sort of, you ask about how are you doing right now and how do you think the US economy is doing right now. The ICE is one where you ask about how do you think, what is the outlook for your own situation and for the US economy. And that's the one I'm going to be looking at. So this is a monthly index, which is averaged from answers over the 500 randomly drawn persons to 3 questions. The first question is about your own economic situation. It says, now looking ahead, do you think a year from now you and your family will be better off financially or worse off or just about the same as now? Next one is about the US business conditions over the next 12 months. And the last one is about US conditions over the next 5 years. Okay? And on each of these, you can give an answer from 1 to 5. 1 is kind of terrible, and 5 is great. This is in the States, and people always go to the extremes. Either things are great, or things are terrible. So you get a lot of variation in this. If you did this in the UK, people will always say, well, it's fine. Like, I remember my daughter's boyfriend, you ask him if things were good, and he would say either this or he'd say this. Right. But in the US, this works. Yeah.
So number 1
yeah.
would suggest that households may think there's pessimism about the current situation, but optimism about the future. So when you have these autonomous sentiment shocks, is that capturing the fact that we could be feeling bad about now, but
Yeah, so you'll actually see how it looks like when I correlate them with stuff, yeah? So, so you can see quite clearly what's going on in these. Okay. So then the index is sort of an average over this here. You take 100 and then you add to it the percentage of those saying 5, so things are great, and you subtract the 1s, those are things that things are terrible, and then you rebase the 1 to 1966. Okay, so let me just show you what they look like. So here I got the ICE in black, so that's a forward-looking one. Then I got the current one in blue, and then the mix, which is the one in red. So if you just fix your eyes on it. Also, the first thing you see is that they fluctuate a lot over time. The other thing you see, but for that you need good eyes, but just let me tell you that the econometrics say that the forward-looking one is kind of leading the current one. So you do see when agents think the future will be great, then you see a bit after that people then actually think things are great as well, and vice versa. If you look at how these things fluctuate with observables, so here in black is confidence, and in blue is industrial production. I detrended here. And you can see that they move together. So when the economy is booming, most agents tend to be positive, and when you go into recession, people turn negative. It's not always the case, so there are exceptions from this, where they actually go opposite ways. Okay? So for example, you can also see that in the Great Recession, they actually do deviate a little bit, but when the economy starts tanking, confidence goes down. So that's with industrial production, monthly data. If you look with unemployment, you actually have a slightly stronger relationship, and it goes the other way. that people are positive when unemployment is low and turn negative when unemployment is high. Okay. So that the correlation there is around 40% in monthly data, and and also confidence is actually slightly leading unemployment. But you do see that they are related. Okay. So now, of course, the question is the fact that they're related. What does that mean? And so I think the first good paper on this is a paper by Matsusaka and Sbordone. They ask if I take the index of consumer sentiment, so the mix of the current and the forward-looking one, to have greater causality. And they found some greater causality from that index to GDP. It turns out that's slightly unstable, so if you were to redo that, then you don't find any greater causality, or it goes both ways, actually. Then there's a paper by Chris Carroll, Fuhrer, and Wilcox. They sort of asked let's say I take a permanent income model and I try and predict consumption with an estimate of permanent income, then does this consumer confidence index, does that have any predictive power on top of that? And it has a little bit. Okay. Then there's a paper by Sidney Ludvigsen, and so she looks at the forward-looking one, and she shows that the ISI has predictive power for consumption growth, but if you include things like the consumption-wealth ratio, then it's not very clear. So that I would say this sort of the consensus out there is that there might be something in it, but it's not terribly clear. But the further problem here is that even if you have predictive power, you greater causality, that may not be because changes in beliefs that have any impact on the economy. That could just be, so suppose this won't happen, but suppose my head of department calls me up and say, listen, I'm going to double your salary a year from now. Now, of course, my confidence will be super high, but this is just because I got the news about my income. And the same when I look at consumer confidence, it could be leading a greater causality because of fundamental shocks, not because of anything else. It doesn't say that if consumers, they turn positive, that that would have any impact on the economy. It's pure endogeneity, okay? So this kind of evidence here is not, you cannot make any causal interpretations of that. So I want to go one step further here. I want to come up with causal evidence. So to do that, so think of consumer confidence, CI. Think of that as some function of current fundamentals. So if my current income is high, I'm very confident. Or maybe it also depends on news. If I have good news, I'm very confident. And then there's some noise. So one source of noise is that I ask only 500 people. It turns out that people differ systematically. Some people are always very negative, and some people are always feeling great. And some people, they change their views a lot, and other people don't. Okay, so with 500 respondents only, you're going to get some of that noise. And then the last component is this sentiment that I want to try and estimate. Okay, so my problem is, how do I isolate that last bit there? Okay. So there's one paper out there that's tried and done that, and I think this is the most famous paper in the field, and it's a great paper by Barsky and Sims. So they did the following. So they estimate a low-scale VAR with consumer confidence, consumption, and output in there. So vector autoregression. So that in the vector autoregression, you get a residual, the U. The U, however, is not a structural shock, so it doesn't have any causal interpretation. It's just a regression residual. It would be a mixture of all kinds of shocks. So what they did was they estimated this VAR, and then they looked at the response of the economy to an innovation to CI. So just to that innovation. Okay, so this is clearly not causal, and they don't claim it's causal either. Okay, but this is what they got. So they used the five-year looking ahead index. So that's a lower one. So that's an innovation at the date T, and then it traces out how consumer confidence then responds over time. So consumer confidence goes up on impact and remains high for around a couple of years. And then in response to that, consumption goes up and output goes up. And actually, they go up very sluggishly, but also extremely persistently. Actually, they have a permanent effect there. Okay, so now the question is, what is driving this here? So they write down a model in which the various sources of fluctuations in consumer confidence. So they have a model in which it's like a new Keynesian model, so with sluggish prices, but the imperfect information. So actual TFP in the economy is there's a random walk component, and then there's a growth component, and the growth component is there are shocks to that. But that comes only with a quarter or 1 period lag here. So that's kind of a new shock, this one here, and this is an actual TFP shock. But then consumers, they can't tell apart when they see AAT moving, they can't tell apart whether that's because of this shock here or it's because of this shock here. So they get a signal on the growth component that is the true value plus some noise. So now sometimes you get noise and you think that you have imperfect information. What you do, you use Bayesian filtering here. And what you do is sometimes you think when noise arrives that is actually the growth rate has gone up, because you only observe A. Okay, so then they assume that consumer sentiments, the equivalent of that is kind of the forecast revision on A plus the change in your view about the growth component here. So when so here sentiments they respond over time because of fundamental shocks to TFP and to the growth, and because of purely expectational shocks. So now the question is, if I went back to the impulse responses I had before, is it this noise shock that is driving it, or is it the fundamental shock? So to estimate that, they match up the model with data, and what they find is that essentially this pure expectational noise has no impact whatsoever. What drives consumer sentiments and what drives the economy are essentially news about future TFP. So if you go back and think and look at the impulse responses that they have, these here, what actually happens here is that you get news about future TFP, you feel very confident, and output and consumption goes up. That's the interpretation. But this comes after putting, the trouble is here is that this here is of course non-causal. The causal interpretation comes from the model. So this is never going to get any better than your model at this point. Yeah. So if you have a model in which this really a lousy model, your interpretation of this is going to be subject to that. So I want to go a different way here. I want to first try and come up with causal evidence and then turn to a model afterwards. Okay. So what I'm going to do that's different is that I'm going to try and isolate this component here. And the way I'm going to do it is that I'm going to propose an instrument here. And so rather than indirectly inferring on sentiments by using a model, I'm going to try and propose an instrument and then directly estimate the causal impact now. That's going to be the way I'm going to do this. Okay, and the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to use something called a proxy SVAR. I'm going to explain in a second that I proposed in a paper in AIR with Carol Mertens. We're kind of on a mission to try and get people to use this here. But if you go to ECB or many central banks, this is actually what they're doing now. So I'm quite happy about that. It's caught on now. Okay, so the idea is here is to come up with an external instrument, something that's not in the VAR, to try and identify a structural shock in the VAR. Okay, and you can do this pretty straightforward using 2-stage or 3-stage least squares. It's an IV estimator. Okay, so here's how I'm going to do it. So I'm going to estimate a VAR. So it's the vector of observables xt here. That depends on their lags and then their innovations. Okay, so I'm gonna assume that the world looks like this here. Now, the problem is that the innovations here are mixtures of structural shocks. So I can rewrite the residuals of the innovations here as some matrix B times a vector of structural shocks. Now, the structural shocks are unobserved. So I need to identify here. Usually the way that is done in VAR is with what I would call internal instruments. Internal instruments means putting restrictions on B here directly. That often is very, very hard to come up with convincing reasons for these parameter restrictions. So this the work of Chris Sims and company. And it's always slightly mysterious where those restrictions come from, and you can always question them. So I'm going to go differently. I'm going to try and come up with an instrument for the shock I'm interested in here. Okay. So I want to identify one shock in this vector here, and then what I need is I need one column from B here. When I got that, and then I got the impulse responses because I already got the dynamic components from up here. Okay. So let me order consumer confidence first in XT so that I want to identify the innovation to the first variable, the structural innovation. Okay. So I want to identify the structural shock to consumer confidence and its effects. Okay. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to propose an instrument, or what I call a proxy ST, and this will allow me to identify under two assumptions. So the first one is that my proxy is correlated with the shock that I'm interested in. This is just a restatement of the relevance condition used in IV. And then I'm going to require that my shock is orthogonal to other structural shocks. So whatever instrument I come up with, I have to defend the assumption that it's not due to some other structural shock. So under that orthogonality condition and under the relevance condition, then it turns out then that identifies my first, or the shock to epsilon Ci or epsilon 1t, and that relevant column now. Okay, the reason why I think this is nice is that now, actually, if you think about this, I can test whether I got a good model, because the relevance condition is testable. Exogeneity is on faith. So there you have to shoot me down if you don't like my instrument. You'll see in a second why I said that. Okay, so that's kind of nice with internal instruments. Instead, I'm taking everything here on faith. But with external instruments, I can look at relevance and I can discuss the exogeneity. Okay? So with that, you can compute, identify impulse responses and so on. So this implements standard IV in a VAR, which I think is a nice way of going. And note here that my proxy needs just to be correlated with the true shock. So the key thing is that it's not my true shock, it's something that is correlated with it. That's all I need. Okay? I can actually also have this as a weak inequality. All I need is that my shock is more strongly correlated with my instrument is more strongly correlated with the shock I'm interested in than with other shocks. In that case, I got the set identification rather than point identification. Yeah. Something like that, yeah. Exactly, yeah, that would be a good one. Yeah. So, so here I'm going to claim instead that I got this holds with equality, that is orthogonal to other shocks. Okay, but notice also this also means that if you got noisy shocks, so measurement error, you can go ahead here. So that's another nice thing to do. That's why we propose this for physical policy. Okay, so now comes the controversial bit. The next slide. My instrument. So I want an instrument that I can claim is correlated with consumer sentiments, but orthogonal to other shocks. So what on earth could that be? So I have to tell you that this is not one I looked for. This came because I wrote a comment to a paper that was published in Nature that I thought was wrong. not my comment, the other paper. But then thinking about what they were doing, I thought, okay, maybe this actually could be a good instrument for consumer confidence. So here's my shot. I'm going to use fatalities in mass shootings in the United States. That's going to be my instrument. So the idea here is that suppose there's a mass shooting somewhere in the States. It gets in all the newspapers, front pages, if these are big dramatic event. It therefore may impact on large cross-section of the US population, and you kind of think it's negative news. But it shouldn't be related to any fundamentals. I'll defend that more, but it turns out that if you look at mass shootings, they are predominantly carried out by people with mental illnesses, and they're sort of uncorrelated to everything observable you can think about. It's not because people are unemployed that they go out and shoot people. Okay? It's not because they weren't promoted when they applied for promotion at work and so on. It's people that are ill, and sometimes they do it. And one main reason why they do it is because they want to be on the front page of a newspaper, and they are on front pages of newspapers. Okay? So my claim is that this is exogenous to our current economic circumstances. And then but now the beauty is, with going the IV way, I can look at relevance now. I can look at, is it actually a good instrument? Okay. So here I'm going to use this only as the only instrument. So here, to be precise, I'm going to have late. I'm going to have I'm going to be estimating local average treatment effects. Tried various other things to have multiple instruments so I can get average treatment effects, but this is the one that I'm concentrating on here.
The number of such mass shootings, or the fact that there is one that's given to that?
So I'm going to use fatalities.
Okay. Total number of fatalities.
Yeah, so fatalities in there. So a mass shooting, the definition of this, that's a shooting with 4 fatalities or more, apart from the perpetrator, carried out by a lone shooter in a public space. That's why they get attention. I'm going to use Mother Jones data as a source for this. Extended with data from they picked up from Wikipedia. But there's also another source from a guy called Dewey. That's slightly different, but on the bigger events, they agree. And it turns out the bigger events are the important ones. These shootings, they are unpredictable over time, but it turns out that actually they do, when one mass shooting happens, then there is increased probability of many smaller shootings after that, things like school shootings and so on. But mass shootings, they are unpredictable over time. Or school shootings, you have some predictability. They happen in states where you have very lax gun laws and so on. These mass shootings are much harder to predict. So these things happen relatively often. So you wouldn't think that any of those have any direct economic cost. Yeah. So after one of these events, there are always lots of discussions about gun laws and so on, and nothing really happens. So this is different from a terrorist attack. A terrorist attack has direct economic consequences because you put in military and stuff. Or a natural disaster has economic consequences directly. So there I couldn't claim exogeneity. But here I can do it because these things happen all the time. Okay. So here's a list of the biggest ones. So you may know some of them. The Texas Tower shooting is an old one. Columbine High School massacre, the Virginia Tech, San Bernardino mass shooting, and so on. So these are all those that had 10 fatalities or more. Lots of important ones. Yeah?
Just very quickly.
Yeah.
The concern is that a lot of these are disgruntled employees. We hear about that, they came back to the office of their employer and they shot a bunch of people. With school shootings, I would buy this, the exogeneity much more easily. But don't we hear a lot of those stories as well?
No, so I mean, so almost all of these, the people that had some mental problem long before this, and for some random reason they go out and shoot. But, yeah. But really, if you look at unemployment, it doesn't really have any predicted. It doesn't have any predicted power for this. Yeah. I mean, that is very hard to test because while there are many of them, there is not a huge amount. Yeah. No, so there is the literature on that used to say that there was a link, but I think like if you look at the last stuff on that, then there doesn't seem to be much. It also turns out that if there is a link between like mental health and unemployment is mostly for women, all of these are men. There's not a single mass shooting in the United States that's carried out by a woman. It's all men. So so that's another issue here. So I think it's very hard to come up with some reason for why these things here happen because of economic conditions. I think
would be prone to do it, but I mean, then at some point you got something, and so I think it has to be checked every day.
So these there are tons of books on many of these. I know of none of those for where that was the case. It's all most of them. They tend to happen. Maybe you had a fight with your parents or stuff like that. Or yeah.
So I have a slightly different question.
Yeah.
These sentiment surveys take place monthly,
Yeah.
right? And you have this data, that sentiment that you are trying to
Yeah.
get from this
Yeah.
shooting incidents is like there is a shooting that happens.
Yeah.
Do you think that persists? The sentiment it's going to affect the sentiment for the next, say for example, it happens on 5th of January. And for the next, because then the surveys are not going to take place immediately after the shooting.
No, so there's going to be a little bit of measurement there or some issue there, yeah. But again, I think because I'm using IV here, I'm doing my best to insulate against that. So that would be the difference to using this as directly as a regressor. Can discuss afterwards, but that's actually one of the reasons why we propose this for fiscal policy, kind of the same issue. Okay. Okay, so here's how they look over time. So these fatalities, so you can kind of see there's a rising trend here. It's getting more and more normal. So we carry out either detrending this here or not. What I'll show you is detrending, but that's just because of discussions. Used to not to do that. Nothing depends on that. Yeah, so that's right. Yeah, so we stop in middle of 2017. So if go forward in time, there's some big ones after this here, and actually the instrument starts performing slightly worse. Yeah, that's true. So if this happens too much, then it's a problem. Yeah. Here is some data just to show that these mass shootings get lots of press coverage. So these are national newspapers, a number of articles about them, and there are lots about them. Sandy Hook, of course, is a very famous one. Lots of school shooters actually quote Sandy Hook as one reason why they did it, because he was on the front page and they want to be as well. It's kind of quite slightly odd thing. You can also look at local news. There's a paper by a guy called Langford. So he looked at mass killers, the 7 biggest shootings since 2012. And actually, it turns out that they get more news coverage than top sports stars and celebrities and so on. So this is like big stuff. So I think at the end of the day, that like the evidence is that when these things happen, most people would know about them. Okay. And it turns out there's also actually direct evidence that when these things happen, people feel worse. And they get for example, if you look at Virginia Tech, there were lots of evidence of students there that PTSD after the Virginia Tech. Okay, so now I'm going to implement. So I'm going to look at monthly US data from 60 to 97. I'm going to estimate a VAR. With consumer confidence, output, with lock of industrial production, unemployment, going to take prices and nominal interest rate in there. Okay. So I'm going to detrend everything. Okay. So first is an F-test for relevance. And when I look at ICI, I get an F-stat here of just above 10. This is corrected for heteroscedasticity, etc. So this is pretty good. There's almost no macro instrument that even comes close to this here. So I would say this is pretty good. Like if you look at all monetary policy instruments, they're nowhere close to 10 in terms of the F. Okay, and 10 is like the magic value if you're used to IV. It works sort of okay for the ICS too, whereas if you take the individual components, none of them has the same information. So it's sort of the aggregate of them. And this is what happens. So so this is the impulse response to confidence estimated with IV using these fatalities as the instrument. And the blue ones around here, the black one is the point estimate. The blue ones is when I take out individual of these big events just to make sure it's not because of one of individual event. And then I got 68 and 95% confidence intervals here computed with a delta method. And what I see is that so a sentiment shock is a sort of persistent decline in consumer confidence that persists around 1.5 to 2 years. Okay, so it's less persistent than the Barsky and Sims non-identified. So it's a drop in so an autonomous belief shock is like sentiment or confidence goes down and remains low for around 1.5 to 2 years. That's what we estimate. Yeah.
So I see that your argument that it's orthogonal to the fundamental shocks.
Yeah.
Then, but how do you differentiate between noise shocks versus this sentiment shocks that you are talking about? Because noise shock is still going to be there unobserved.
So so if it's pure noise you mean pure noise in the survey?
Like for example, in Blanchard's paper,
yeah. So I will think about this as noise shocks, okay? But but that's a structural interpretation. So here this is just like an autonomous change in consumer confidence that is not due to a fundamental.
So it can be the sentiment shock, or you can call that as a noise shock. There is.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that afterwards you'll have to translate it into a model.
So you are not differentiating between noise shocks versus sentiment shocks here.
No. So here I'll just call this for a sentiment shock. It's a drop in consumer sentiment, estimated through IV.
And that's not accounted for the fundamentals.
Huh?
That's not accounted for.
That is not due to a real change in the fundamental. Yeah. So this here shows the relevance assumption is satisfied. Okay. Just to make sure that this is not due to pure luck, this here is placebo. I just reshuffling the shootings, and I see when I do the placebo, I get absolutely nothing. Okay. So relevance seems to be there. So now I'm going to look at the causal effect. So I'm going to look at what happens in the economy after a 1% drop in consumer confidence, and I'm going to look at the VAR. Now I'm also going to look at some other variables. I'm not going to compare to Cholesky. Yeah. Okay. So this is the main picture from the empirical bit here. So this is what I just showed you. The IV estimate of a change in consumer confidence, the impact on confidence in itself. So it drops for 1.5 to 2 years. In response to that, what we get is we get a persistent drop in industrial production, maximum impact around a year after, and then recovery. Unemployment goes up and keeps on rising for around a year to a year and a half, and then comes down. Then a slight increase in inflation and a drop in the nominal interest rate. That's what we find. So this here is like what the pure belief-driven changes in the economy, but the dynamics that we said about in output, in unemployment, in inflation, and in nominal interest rate. The one interesting thing here about the nominal interest rate is that declines. So there could be two reasons for that. So one is that the central bank is reacting to the slump in unemployment and the drop in output. Or the other one is maybe central bank reacts directly to consumer sentiments. But maybe they look at it. So we know that if you go to the Fed, they look at this. Okay, so we know that they do look at it, but maybe they're looking at it just because of this here. I'll show you. Okay. So one thing we did here in order to try and sort that out actually was to look at so the Gödler-Karate monetary policy shocks. So ask, can we actually predict that? So the shock, not the interest rate. So it turns out that if you do that with local projection, you can predict it a bit. So part of the reason why you get the drop in nominal interest rate may be because the central bank actually reacts to these consumer sentiment shocks directly by looking at consumer confidence. Yeah. Yeah, but this is not an issue, so everything here is correct relative to a constant term. But you could, if you could come up with a good positive shock for the United States, that would be great. Actually, we looked long for that. Like in Europe, it'd be easy because like World Cup and stuff like that. But so first of all, US never win the World Cup, so that doesn't work. But also like those kind of national events, there are not so many of those. So when I do that, I do it exactly that way. So you will see. So I can take care of that. Yeah. Huh? Yeah, but Americans, I don't care that much about that. A bit. Yeah. Okay, 10 minutes. I have to speed up. So let me look at some other variables here. What happens with other stuff? Okay, so this is what happened with consumption, non-durables consumption. So also a drop actually bigger than output and very persistent. So this does look like a sort of a demand shock. TFP doesn't move at all. So this is important. So it's not the shock that Bask and Sims were talking about, because there one would be one where TFP should drop. But here we don't find any response of TFP whatsoever. Okay? Look at uncertainty, maybe a slight increase in uncertainty, but that could be purely endogenous as well. If I look at stock prices as well, they then don't really react. So this turns out that what we identify is much more like what Hall talks about, this common component to stuff that happens in the labor market. It's not the stock market stuff that Schiller is talking about. So if I look at the variance forecast error variance decomposition, then this shock accounts for around 40 to 20% of consumer confidence variations. So a lot of consumer confidence actually are these changes, autonomous changes in confidence. But it also accounts for around 10 to 20% of unemployment variations. Not much of output, but unemployment. Or you look at vacancies or job finding rates, this thing shows up there. So this is exactly the whole kind of stuff. Okay? So because of monetary policy response, it also accounts for relatively big share of variations in nominal interest rates. So this is kind of important. It should be in there with the shocks that we talk about when we talk about what drives fluctuation. So this here would say sometimes we get a boom because people turn optimistic. Sometimes we get a recession because of pessimism. That's essentially what this is saying. And it's reflected particularly in the labor market. No.
But that's surprising because the results are that the stock market is quite vulnerable to sentiment.
Yeah. So this doesn't dispute the fact that there might be other shocks that are driving kind of the stock market, but it's not the one I'm identifying with this instrument here. So there might be other ways of identifying that shock. But you could think there could be many different reasons why you have fluctuations in producer consumer sentiment. So with the instrument, I'm teasing out one of this, yeah, but there may be other ones, yeah. If I look at the volatility, it's like, so this is actually the stock price. So you can see at the 1 year horizon, like 3% of the forecast error variance. So it's not so important. But there still accounts for more than 10% of unemployment. So it's much more important in the labor market. So, okay, so I'll have to like skip over most of the details of the model. But the model is one in which the householders search for jobs, but incomplete markets, so they face uninsurable unemployment shocks. Then there are firms that set prices, they're higher in the frictional labor market and price adjustment cost. And then there's a monetary authority that sets the nominal interest rate. It turns out that this combination of frictions here gives you amplification mechanism. Okay. So I'm going to have in here persistent aggregate productivity shocks, transitory aggregate productivity shocks, monetary policy shocks, but then like in Baskin and Sims and Blanchard and so on, imperfect common information. So you only observe the sum of these two here, but you get a signal on the persistent component. So my source of non-fundamental shocks are this noise you get about this you get in this signal here. And there's Bayesian learning about that. So now I want to think about, suppose a pure noise shock comes along, how do you respond to it? Okay, and here's how it's going to work. Let me see if I can get the intuition going here. So here, suppose some negative noise comes along. Then people look at this, they get a signal but on the sum of the true persistent component and then this pure noise. But they don't know, is it actually, when they get the noise, they'll think, well, this may be because true persistent productivity has gone down. They can't really tell. So now I sort of turn negative. Now, so suppose I think that persistent productivity, there's a negative shock to that, and I have a job today. If I have a job today, my forecast will be that A, my wage will go down, but B, also that some risk now that I'm going to lose my job. And because of that, there's going to be an increase in precautionary savings because of the unemployment risk. This doesn't happen when you got complete markets, but with incomplete markets, there's precautionary savings. So now goods demand goes down, and firms look at the drop in goods demand. Now, if prices were flexible, when demand goes down, prices just adjust to it, and nothing more happens. But now, because prices are sticky, when goods demand goes down, firms are going to hire less labor. That's a key thing you got from pricing frictions. Okay, so now when firms hire less labor, unemployment is going to go up. Real wages will be falling as well. But now think about what happens if unemployment goes up. Suppose I have a job today and I see unemployment going up. I start thinking, well, labor market is getting weak. Now, what would happen now if I lost my job? It would be hard to find a new job, so I better do some precautionary savings now. So now households, they do precautionary savings because of the increase in unemployment. That means that there's less goods demand. That means that firms are hiring less, and that gives you amplification now. So this happens only because I got incomplete markets, I got sticky prices, and I got matching in the labor market. You remove one of those, and this mechanism is not there. Well, okay, so no, well, I mean two things. So I mean, first of all, like if I feed in a pure noise shock, like without, for example, with flexible prices, it will have a little bit of effect, but it will be very small. Or I feed it in without the precautionary savings due to incomplete markets, it will have some effect, but it will be very small. In this economy here, there will be this amplification here. You will get a bigger impact because the goods demand triggers low goods demand, triggers low labor demand, that triggers low goods demand, that triggers low labor demand. Well, so it turns out if that mechanism is strong enough, then I have another paper in which I show there may actually be multiple steady states. And if there are multiple steady states, I can have stochastic sunspots as well. I won't look at stochastic sunspots here, but that one could do that, yeah. But it turns out that this amplification here, that relies upon this unemployment here driving the precautionary savings. But real wages also fall here. That actually takes precautionary savings the other way. So it turns out that, that everything will depend on a wedge in the model, that there's something we call the endogenous risk wedge. If that is pro-cyclical, real wages dominate, and you get stabilization. So almost no effect of these sentiment shocks. If unemployment dominates, you get the interaction between the supply and demand side, and you get amplification. So that's with counter-cyclical endogenous risk. And that is the one thing I can go out and estimate now. Okay? So how I'm doing? 5 minutes. Okay, so I'm gonna scroll through this. If there's anything that looks strange, it's a typo. Our households maximize utility. There's some cost of working. They consume a basket of goods. They either work or they work or there's home production. That's like unemployment benefits. Okay. Production, there's a true technology here. Then there's capital and labor and variable capacity utilization. Employment dynamics, so you hire new workers by posting vacancies that gets filled with a probability queue here and are costly, and there's capital accumulation. In the labor market, there's matching between unemployed workers and vacancies that gives me an endogenous job finding rate and endogenous job filling rate that depend on labor market tightness. Firms set prices that are monopolistically competitive, but there's a price adjustment cost. Okay, then we assume that wages depend on labor market or on the job finding rate or labor market tightness. And then there's the central bank that sets an interest rate that target an inflation rate, and then there's a monetary policy shock. All right, this model, because of incomplete markets, sticky prices, labor market matching, is phenomenally complicated. I mean, if you want to solve that one as it is, good luck. It'll take you half a year. So models simpler than this has been solved. Like this full model like this here, there's really nothing out there. So we pull a trick to solve it easily. And the trick we pulled is that we assume limited participation in the stock market. And with that, it turns out this takes me no more time to solve than a standard New Keynesian model. And all I have is, in equilibrium, there's a group of rich guys that own the firms that don't work, and there's a group of poor guys that work or are unemployed. And the poor guys that worry about, those that have a job, worry about losing their job. Those that are unemployed, they search for jobs. Okay? And let me just skip, but okay, so the information structure is the one I told you about. I got the noise shocks, so these are my sentiment shocks, to the signal about the persistent productivity shock. And I allow them also to impact on monetary policy. I allow the monetary policy maker to respond to noise. Okay. So it turns out that the whole new thing that happens in this model here is a modified Euler equation. So this is the Euler equation for workers that have a job today. Consumption today depends on expected consumption tomorrow, and then depends on the real interest rate, and then it depends on this thing here. So this is different from a standard Euler equation in complete markets because there's discounting here. In the standard Euler equation in locked linearized, this is 1. Beta is equal to the inverse of the real interest rate. This is not true here because of incomplete markets, so you got discounting. The second thing that happens is this wedge here, which is this amplification mechanism, which may be positive or negative. So it turns out when this is positive, I got amplification. I won't tell you about that, but let me just skip to the results now. And I'll be done. Okay, so we estimate the parameters taking into account that exactly how this is measured in the data. So, so this is with indirect inference and so on. I didn't skip the details of that, but I just want to show you what happens now when I estimate parameters. So when I estimate parameters, I get this risk wedge here, which is positive. So that means I got amplification. And I get that because the risk, you lose a lot of income if you lose your job, and and because of risk aversion, and because real wages are not very flexible. Then price stickiness is around 6 months here, according to our estimate. Right, so this is what we get. So this, the blue line here, and that's from the empirical estimate, or the orange line is from the data. The blue is what the model says when I estimated the data. So I match the response of consumer confidence, of output, of unemployment, a little bit less on inflation, but the interest rate I get pretty well. Okay, so now I've got a structural interpretation of what is going on here. So what is going on is when there's a consumer sentiment shock. So here's a positive one. Consumers think that actual persistent productivity has gone up. So a shooting would be the negative. You turn negative because you think productivity has gone down. Then because of that, unemployment goes up and the job finding rate declines. Then output declines because this is a drop in aggregate demand and consumption declines. And inflation here turns out to go up a little bit because the monetary policy is responding to this. Yeah. If I didn't have my amplification mechanism, so I took a standard New Keynesian model, this is what I would get. And you can see then I would get absolutely nothing. When I turn negative, it doesn't impact of unemployment because it gets stabilized. So I get a response there, increase in unemployment, because when I get a bad signal, I start saving, firms hire less, unemployment goes up, I save more. Eventually I figure out, oh, things are not that bad. It was some noise and unemployment comes back to normal then. But in the beginning I get confused, and because of this amplification I get a big response. It's also, what is going on is central bank is actually stabilizing here through its response to consumer sentiment. So the orange here is when I don't allow the central bank to respond. Then I would have gotten even bigger increase in unemployment, because what happens when consumers turn negative here is that the central bank cuts the normal interest rate. If they hadn't done that, unemployment would have gone up even more. So it turns out that actually your stabilization through monetary policy. If I look at variances, I get in the model, these shocks account for around 8% of unemployment, 6% of vacancies, 9% of job finding rate, and around 10% of consumption at the 1 year horizon. So not extremely different from the data. If I shut down monetary policy response, this accounts for around 20% instead. So it turns out that actually monetary policy is stabilizing. Okay, let me stop there.
Yeah, it's a very interesting, excellent paper. So I know Hank models are in their infancy, and the focus is on consumption. But if you had a model with investments in capital, that could also lead to a further source of amplification.
Yeah, so here.
Firms adjust, given lower labor demand, they adjust their investment decisions downwards.
So in this model, I do have capital and investment in here. So yeah, so actually I think it's actually the first estimated Hank model with capital and investment in as well. So it turns out that can stabilize or amplify, because so one thing that happens here is that so the real interest rate is going down, so that kind of induces investment. On the other hand, goods demand is low, and that discourages investment. So they're kind of fighting against each other, these two mechanisms. And in equilibrium, with this calibration here, they almost neutralizing each other. But that depends very much on parameters, yeah. So if this like demand-supply interaction is very strong, then it gives further push. If it's not so strong, then it turns out capital is kind of stabilizing. So there is a fight between those two mechanisms in the model here. And as I say, with our estimates, they're almost balancing out. That's also why stock market doesn't react that much. Because if the fall in the real interest rate was so strong it would induce investment, then the stock market should rise. If instead demand effect is so strong that the investment is dropping, the stock market should be dropping. What I saw in the data is stock market doesn't react much, and the model kind of is reconciling this by having these two mechanisms almost balancing out. Yeah.